Well, I came from Cleveland, Ohio. I went to Case Institute and got a degree in engineering. Then I went to work for the city a little while in Cleveland and learned about city planning and thought that was kind of exciting. After which I went to North Carolina, got a master's degree in planning. Then after brief stints in Youngstown and Charleston, I came to Atlanta in 1956 with the old Metropolitan Planning Commission, which was 2 counties then. I started as a community planner. Which I did local assistance for places like Marietta and East Point that had no staffs. And by 1959, I was the planning director. It was pretty clear that the 2 counties of the metropolitan area really didn't cover the metropolitan area, even defined by the census. So we started a movement to expand it and created what was then known as the Atlanta Region Metropolitan Planning Commission. 2 of the leading figures in that were Howard Minhinnick, who was then the head of the planning school at Georgia Tech. He and I wrote proposed legislation as to what this new organization would be to bring it up to date. Excuse me. And a guy named Charlie Emmerich, who was the chairman of DeKalb County Board of Commissioners, and a really good guy, really very good government type person. He was at the time the head of what was known as the Metropolitan Council of Chambers of Commerce, working through them and getting the support of the Georgia Municipal Association, county commissioners, and so on. We were able to get an act introduced. It wasn't opposed much by the governments. It was opposed largely by some of the consultants who were afraid that our technical assistants would be competing with them, and I just wasn't concerned about that. And it did pass. Actually, on the last day of the legislature, they were about to run out of time, and it wasn't up yet, and they needed a guy to vote, and one of the Cobb County legislators was off celebrating already, and they had to send a state trooper after him to bring him back so he could vote. So we did get the act through. And as a result of that, we were able to expand from 2 to 5 counties, which was progressive at that time. We were able to get a stable budget source, which the old group, which had been created in 47, didn't have. We were able to get the heads of local governments on the board rather than simply citizens, starting towards the ARC approach. And beyond that, we also split up the directorship into the executive directorship and the planning directorship. The executive director did the administrative relationships, and I headed up the planning staff. And I think that laid the groundwork then for the Atlanta Regional Commission. 1966, I had been with the old MPC, which became the new AR MPC, for about 10 years. We were in the old Glenn building at the corner of Spring and Marietta, which I think is still there. I didn't feel old until I discovered that that building had been declared a historic monument, which I didn't think was that old, or that I was that old. Anyway, I became the planning director of the then newly created Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which consisted of the local governments in Maryland and Virginia suburbs and the District of Columbia, a very complicated network of governments. I stayed there for 3 years, hired a staff, set up the planning program, at which time Al Voorhees, whom some people might know here, came to me and asked me if I would please apply to become executive director of AIP, which is the American Institute of Planners. That, as of that time, was the national organization of professional planners. And they were in a mess. I don't know why I took it, but I did. They were in debt. They had just canceled their national annual conference. We were right in the middle of the Vietnam era when the younger students were claiming the old planners were old fogies, and the old fogies were claiming the young planners were young. It was a mess. We had sit-ins at the conferences and all sorts of things. At the same time, the board of AIP was starting a new membership examination program, a new series of specialty departments for transportation and so on, and a new set of state chapters, because up till then they had been regional chapters. Well, I stupidly came into it. After 3 years, I think we straightened all that out. And at that time, I got a call from Dan Sweat, whom I had known dearly from the old Atlanta days. He had just taken over the new ARC, which was a natural evolution of the old AR-MPC. This is alphabet soup, I know. The Atlanta Regional Commission was to supplant the Atlanta Region Metropolitan Planning Commission. 7 counties now. Dan was a very progressive guy. I knew that he would be working for all kinds of governmental reforms and changes towards regionalism. And my other offer was to be the environmental person with the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and I thought that would be hard to do. So I came back here, and I stayed with ARC for about 5 years. I think the main things that we did at ARC that I value were, first of all, the first thing we had to do is update the regional development plan, bring it up to date, and expand it to 7 counties. One of the most important roles, which I suspect ARC still performs, is this business of mandatory referral, where under various state and federal laws, somebody who wants to build a particular kind of project that might endanger a rapid transit right-of-way or a river protection area must submit the project for review. There's nothing mandatory about it, but ARC makes the decision as to whether it's in conflict with local or regional plans. So the decision is made under a more glaring light, less likely to lead to an abusive or undesirable project. And after about, 5 years with ARC, I decided to be a private consultant just because I wanted to have my own little toy store, and George Eichler, who had been the environmental director from ARC, and I started a little planning firm, which then became Thomas H. Roberts Associates. I spent about 15 years at that, and I really enjoyed it because I don't particularly like administering planners. I like to be a planner. I like to get my hands in it and do the planning, and I was able to do that. And I found that as a consultant, people were more likely to listen to you than if you're just a staff member. I don't know why, but maybe because you charge them by the hour. I guess my most notorious part of consulting was I did a lot of Florida work, because Florida has state laws requiring certain planning things. And I was a consultant to Lee County, which is where Fort Myers and Sanibel and Pine Island and those places are located. And state law had really, I thought, unreasonable requirements for a county like Lee. They were mandating that you show on a map the future land use by type and by density 30 years into the future. You just couldn't do that. You could do that for Palm Beach, which is a little island. So I developed a thing called the Roberts Overlay, which was a kind of a trick to meet the state law, but keep the county commissioners out of the difficulty of having to make decisions they couldn't live with. And I thought that was just good. The Roberts Overlay, that was sort of an eponymous guy is like George Washington, where something's named after him, like the George Washington Bridge. So now the Roberts Overlay meant that I was eponymous. And I came back down thinking I would be cheered. Well, I didn't realize that as the county commissioners, who were partly corrupt, were going this way, the people were going the other way, and they didn't like it at all. And I got off the plane, and I had the vague feeling that the villagers were coming with their torches and their pitchforks to tar and feather me, to mix a metaphor. Anyway, that's probably the most famous or infamous I became during my consulting days. And I think that about brings my career about up to date. The only other thing, no, that's about it. That's about right.
If we could go back a little bit to the formation of the ARMPC, or is it the first iteration, when you and Howard Manhennick, of course, Manhennick worked on our state Planning and Zoning Enabling Act.
Yes, and he was the head of planning for the Georgia Tech Planning School and the founder.
Right. Some of the provisions that went into the bill that created ARMPC, such as the chief elected official has to sit on the board versus a designated person, which is unique among many regional planning agencies. That it has to be that.
And was the beginning of the whole Council of Governments movement at that time around the country. HUD was urging that heads of local governments be on the boards, not just citizens, so that when they voted to implement something at the regional level, they could go back and implement it as local government head. As you know, that doesn't always work that way, but it puts local government heads in an accountable position on the regional questions.
And so I guess ARC was, we often talk about ARC being the first multi-jurisdictional regional planning agency. You were involved in, I guess, this movement to create regional planning.
Yeah, in fact, I believe in 1947, when the General Assembly first passed the MPC Act, the two-county MPC Act, which had a lot of limitations, it was the first publicly supported and created intergovernmental, I'm trying to say it just right, regional planning commission. So there are a number of firsts in ARC's history.
Now, do you remember, I guess, can you tell me some of the plans that you were in those early years, you were instrumental, I guess, in the first 10 years of your employment at ARC. You had two stints of employment at ARC, so I guess that first one, 56 to 66, what were some of the influential activities?
Well, Bob, there had been a series of directors, Bruce Wedge, who later became a regional director of HUD, and then Phil Hammer, who was a very bright economic general planner, who was the second director, and then Bob Stewart was the third one, and then I came along when he left. And we started two studies. The preservation of the downtown was very important in those days because so many cities were losing their downtowns, in effect. And this is was very important to the stakeholders like Rich's, who was the big department store, now a part of Macy's and so on. And so we did two studies. One was called Access to Central Atlanta, showing the roads that would come in through the downtown cordon and showing that access couldn't be accommodated by roads and freeways. It just wouldn't be enough to handle the growth. Then the next study we did was called Crosstown and Bypass Expressways. And these were pretty little modest studies when you look at them. And they took the future population projections and put them into cars and buses and put them on the freeways and found that an unbelievable number of lanes would be required just to move people in and out in a radial way. I learned a lesson on that. I think I had something like, in the year so-and-so, between 36 and 48 lanes would be required to handle access to the north. Well, my point was that that's absurd. I went home and was talking to a neighbor. He said, "Hey, I see on TV that you were saying that we're going to have to build 48 lanes. I don't see how we have room for that." So I came to learn that you have to make it clear that you're talking hypothetically. Anyway, those two studies clearly pointed out that a highway, freeway dominant system just wasn't going to cut it. Besides, there were new rapid transit systems growing up in San Francisco and other places. So we went ahead and we did a study called What You Should Know About Rapid Transit. And it was fairly elementary, simple thing. What is rapid transit? What is it not? A lot of people here tended to equate rapid transit with old, ugly places in New York with graffiti and so on. And a lot of people said, no, you need monorails or air-supported things. And not, we talked, and we created a road show where Glenn Bennett, the executive director, and I, the planning director, and Johnny Bivens, who had sort of done the groundwork on the planning, we went everywhere, any place anybody would meet. The Kiwanis Club, the Chamber, anybody. And we just talked about rapid transit. We built up the idea. Then along about that time, we were about to complete the regional development plan for the first time on a 5-county basis. And we took the rapid transit plan, which we'd created by that time, and put it into the regional development plan and made the argument that rapid transit not only served by carrying people, but it would be a heck of a region shaper if you would orient land use development around the stations and so on. But that's worked to some extent, not as well as should. And that led to, we wanted a little traction to get more exposure. So we got the General Assembly to create I think it was called the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Study Commission or something, put former Governor Vandiver, I think, was chairman, and, different people. Atlanta's always had a very good business leadership, unlike other cities. Atlanta business leaders over the years have always had sort of a noblesse oblige. It's our job to keep Atlanta healthy. And we'd get bond issues passed. And that study commission we staffed, it wasn't the ARMPC, which we also staffed. It was a side group. And then we hired, after looking at various proposers, Walter Douglas, who was the father of rapid transit in San Francisco, and a very fine very fine guy, not only an engineer, but a Renaissance man in many ways. We brought him to town and we said, would you look at our regional plan to see if it seems to be feasible? And he said, yeah. It was a longer yeah, but yes. He made a couple of changes. And then we hired his firm, which was then Parsons, Brinkerhoff, Quaid, and Douglas. They've changed their name many times, to come in, take the rapid transit plan, which was a part of the regional development plan, and give it a hard engineering feasibility study, which they did. What I'm trying to show you here is that the construction is a small part of getting rapid transit. The next thing was to get a constitutional amendment so that local governments in Georgia would be authorized to have rapid transit. Jim Mackey, who was on the state legislature, said, well, you know, local amendments aren't really good political science. What you want is a statewide amendment. I said, okay, so we had a statewide amendment. Well, these other 150-some counties look at rapid transit and says, no, we don't want that. So it failed. We came back with a local amendment only applying to the 5 counties that would be affected. That passed. Then the local governments had to vote to join, and only Atlanta, Fulton, and DeKalb voted to join. Unfortunately, Clayton and Cobb and Gwinnett were not urban enough, didn't feel the pinch enough to make that leap and come in. Then the next question is, how do you finance it? Well, they try, and I was gone during this time up in Washington. They tried a property tax, I believe, and that failed. And a large part of the black community in Atlanta didn't see the point of this thing, how it was going to help them. So Sam Massell, who was then the mayor, worked out some kind of a deal, I'm told, that he said, if you'll promise that the fare will only be 15 cents so people can ride it, and guarantee that for a certain number of years, then we'll support it. We'll support a sales tax. Well, the sales tax passed in those 3 counties. And that led to then ARC's role in reviewing transit plans, reviewing station areas, making sure that projects weren't usurping land to be needed for transit. And then construction of the system began in the 70s. So that's the beginning, the inception of rapid transit. And I think it's one of the most important things we ever did. I am sorry that it doesn't go out into the other counties. Something's going to have to happen along those lines, and it'll be jerry-built instead of having the lines actually go out. But I feel bad every time we go out and widen the freeway from 8 lanes to 12 lanes. We're constantly widening freeways because it's one of those obvious things you do. Well, you got cars on the freeway. We've got to widen it. Well, that's not what you got to do. You got to put something else that can move people more efficiently along with the freeway. So that's my little story on rapid transit. And I'm very pleased that Atlanta got a modern system.
Can you? There's somewhere I remember a story about how Atlanta decided to apply for funding with, I guess it would have been UMTA then, rather than FTA, Urban Mass Transit.
I think it was actually HHFA before UMTA.
Oh, was it?
UMTA is the Urban Mass Transit,
which I guess changed
for those people who don't like alphabets.
In the late 80s, it changed.
Yeah. We got a grant. Actually, we got I think it was probably what was then called a 701 grant. It was a planning grant, pulling strings and so on. And then Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey started getting federal legislation to fund the construction of transit. Unfortunately, that's the same Harrison Williams who was later caught in the ab scam snare. Showed him on film taking monies from Arabs, which was a fake setup. It was probably entrapment, but he went to prison. But he did a good thing by starting funding for rapid transit.
And were you involved in the initial application, or I can't I recall that you had some involvement in that, but I'm not.
I was in and around that. Glenn Bennett, who was the administrative guy, as I say earlier, I may be odd, but I like to do planning. And one of the things I didn't like about ARC, and it's no fault of anybody but mine, I wasn't doing planning. It would be Monday morning, and we'd call a meeting of people to talk about the last meeting so we could set an agenda for the next meeting to prepare for another meeting. And I was signing letters that I hadn't written, and that's great, but I just not the kind of thing I want. But after I became a consultant, APA asked me to write an article on why I made this switch, and they put the headline on it, which I didn't write, called "Why I Left a Cushy Job to Be My Own Boss" when I left ARC to be a consultant. And I got more reactions from guys around the country. Jesus, all I do is papers, and when you're a consultant, you do the planning. I mean, if you're a self-employed guy without a staff, you do it.
Well, if you talk a little bit about your consulting, because you did a lot of training, didn't? I
did. Well, the American Public Works Association, which is this is funny. There are a bunch of groups in Washington, including then AIP, American Public Works Association, the American Municipal Association. Various public agencies have their association headquarters in Washington. And they meet as a group called the Public Interest Groups, summarized as PIGs, which unfortunately goes back to pork and trough. But the PIGs would meet, and the American Public Works Association was one of those, and they asked me would I please put together a training program because they were sponsoring a series of training sessions for public works directors around the country. And public works directors needed to know more about zoning and subdivision regulations and how they weren't just a pain in the neck, they were really useful to public works. And so I did that. I went around for, 20, 25 cities putting that thing on. And of course, in return, I learned a lot about what public works directors tend to look cynically at this kind of stuff, but they could see it was useful for protecting right-of-way and getting plat regulations for subdivision, so we could show the relationship. And then I wrote some articles for the International City Management Association on the idea of that was we're sort of reformers, but within the system that we're not. This goes back to the Vietnam era where people, if you were part of the system, you were bad. If you were a planner over 30, you were an old fogey. And then I taught some at Georgia Tech, not as a permanent professor, and at Georgia State. I taught advanced courses to the graduate students.
And you had some, I understand, a good deal of involvement in Florida with impact fees and other.
I did.
And other.
Florida had then, and I suppose still does, very strict planning requirements. Every local government had to have plan. I won't go through the details, but as a result, local governments in Florida, which were growing leaps and bounds, were trying to relate highway capacity to land use capacity, which is, I wish we did that here, because then we develop land and the densities over here, and over here somebody's building transportation, and nobody says, well, if you build this many houses, you got to have this many lanes, and you can't. We don't have that kind of coordinate. And I know that's a very, I think, progressive, but a very radical idea. Anyway, Florida was into that. And a part of it was impact fees, which Georgia now has to some extent. Impact fees were a way to get new developers to pay their proportionate share of infrastructure costs. And a big fight. Developers didn't want impact fees. The sewers were there. Let us use them. And so there were two other fellows, Julian Juergensmeyer, who is now a professor of law at Georgia State, who was then at the University of Florida, and Jim Nicholas, who was a urban planning economist type. And we created a little team that would go out and go around and write impact fees for local governments, because there were certain things you had to do to make it right. You had to make sure. My job in the team was to link the impact fee to the plan. It couldn't just be that the city council votes one night and says, hey, let's charge the developer so many dollars. You had to show how this was going to go back and relate to the infrastructure need had to be connected, called a rational nexus, they said. So we became what we known as the I-team for impact fee. And we went around Florida writing impact fee statements, fairly new in those days. Now I understand. I talked to Julian at your affair of or that little luncheon, and now they're going around attacking allegedly invalid impact fees. So they're working both sides, because impact fees can be abusive or they can be helpful, depending on how they're written.
And I'm sorry to
That's all right.
get into Florida, but I wanted to sort of touch on some of that.
Florida is fascinating, and people would say, why don't you come down here and open an office instead of flying down? I said, but then I'd just be another Florida consultant. This way I'm a big expert from Atlanta, quote, unquote. So I'd fly down, and I could charge more, because I was from outside. But Florida has so many different places. The town of Palm Beach, which is a little island with a limited population and practically no vacant land use, they're tailor-made for Florida state planning laws. Well, you can actually say where is it going to go and how's it going to go. But Lee County, which is a four corners, wild, open place, it just wasn't applicable. And unfortunately, the planners who worked for the state planning people in Tallahassee, most of whom had no experience in local or regional planning, didn't understand that. So it took some effort.
I want to get back to talking about Atlanta, but first I wanted to just you covered well the sort of the merging of AIP and ASPO, and Leon Epplin covered that too. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experiences. You mentioned when you're the executive director of AIP, and
sure,
during the Vietnam era and sit-ins at the conferences and some of that. That sound.
I might go back for a minute to the crazy '60s when I was at AIP, at the American Institute of Planners, as it was then. It was headquartered in Washington, and our job was to keep track of the planners and have tests and so on, and ethics codes, and also to interface with congressional committees and federal departments. And it was a mess. I thought that, coming into planning, I thought I was really being a very progressive, forward-looking person as a young planner. Planners are sort of like the clergies. They were in those days, and we're going to go out and improve things, make things better for people. Well, along about that time, the Vietnam War was bubbling along, and the students from the planning schools were saying, well, you don't have enough black people, which is true. You have these tests. Tests are no damn good. We know how to plan. You hire us, we want to make policy, and you got us drawing pictures. Anyway, AIP is an old crazy idea, and I won't go through it, but people would show up in their dashikis at the board meetings and use the F word and the N word. Oh, it was embarrassing. It was difficult. I think those 3 years probably forged me in the fires of reality, actually to the point of becoming discouraged. And it was kind of a relief to come back to Atlanta, because Atlanta wasn't in the focus of that as much as Washington's the place where you go to demonstrate. That's what it's for. That's part of what it's for. And people would chain themselves to the White House gate, and you couldn't be the executive director of AIP without being totally right down the middle between the senior planners who said the old ways are the best ways, and the new planners were saying your ways suck, and I was supposed to keep peace in the family. So it was painful, frankly. Now, I think we haven't talked about the Georgia chapter of the American Planning Association. Let's go back and kind of go through that quickly. Back in the 60s, there was the American Institute of Planners, which I described. There was the American Society of Planning Officials, which I will describe, and there was the Georgia Planning Association, which I will describe. Now, the American Institute of Planners was an old organization going back to 1917 or something, made up of professional planners, originally mostly consultants, and with the advent of federal aid, a lot of public planners. And AIP's job was to have a code of ethics, to have technical publications to some extent, to have regional chapters, to promote the image of the professional planner, and to keep the standards high. That's here in Washington. Over here in Chicago was another old organization called the American Society of Planning Officials, which also dealt with planning, but there were many differences. There were no membership requirements. The idea was if you had $20 and you were a mayor or a planning commissioner or a neighborhood organizer or anybody that liked planning, and the professional planners tended to belong too, you were in the American Society of Planning. They didn't have local chapters. They had lots of publications. They had no membership requirements. And you can see this, whereas maybe their foci were a little different, they had a big overlap. Meanwhile, in many of the states, there were what are known as the little ASPOs, although they were not associated with the American Association of Planning Officials. And the Georgia Planning Association was one. It, like ASPO, was a citizens, anybody, mayors. I believe President Carter was an early president of GPA. Well, then in the 1970s, you had these three organizations. You had AIP, which was professional planners in Washington. You had ASPO, which was all kinds of planning interested people in Chicago. And you had GPA, which had grown up in the meantime as a citizen-based organization in Georgia for planning board members and mayors and whatever. Then there was a movement to merge AIP, and these alphabet things get out of control, but to merge the American Institute of Planners and the American Society of Planning Officials. That had always been resisted in the past because the two organizations were national, had historic pride. They weren't going to be merged by somebody else. And whenever it was brought up, it never got it. It gets studied to death by what planners do, and they never come back and do it. Well, along about then, I was the recently departed executive director of AIP, so I had good feelings with those people. And I was also the president-elect of ASPO, which had just been elected, whose executive director was Israel Stallman, who was my boss back in Youngstown, so we'd been friends forever. Now, I don't mean to imply that because we were friends that made it happen, but sometimes if you know people, you don't have to start with suspicions and so on. So David Godshock, who's I don't know if he's retired now, but planner from North Carolina, UNC, we were flying to the meeting together, and we said, hey, we ought to bring up this merger thing again. We brought it up, and we said, no more study commissions, and we tried to keep it simple. And before we knew it, we had a negotiating committee to talk about. I think, again, because some of us had one foot in each organization, by golly, we got together and we worked out arguments about dues and what are you going to do about the professional planners? Well, we would create an APA, which would be the umbrella, and then within that we'd have AICP, which would be an independent organization that's responsible for keeping planning standards high and certifying planning schools and all that sort of thing. But APA would be the broad one. And we had to have an election, and everybody thought that ASPO would go along with it, but AIP it was just the opposite. ASPO barely passed it among the members, and AIP passed it more heavily. And as a result, now we had APA. Now, AIP brought to the table the fact that it had state chapters. ASPO didn't have chapters. ASPO brought other things to the table, and as a result, APA took on the local chapters of there was a Georgia chapter of AIP. That became the Georgia chapter of APA. Well, the Georgia chapter of APA is virtually the same idea as the Georgia Planning Association, so they kind of organize. And that's the way ASPO and AIP and GPA became APA, AICP, and GPA. That's very confusing, but that's the way it happened.
What year did you become president of APA?
I became president-elect of ASPO, which then became APA during that period. ASPO had a system whereby they didn't elect a president, they elected a president-elect, and then he was around for a year, so they automatically became president. And what was your question, what year?
Yeah, so then did you become president at the merger? Or?
I became president for about 20 minutes because we had a merger meeting of the boards, and I was presiding because I was the only president around, and we had to elect a president of the new APA. Well, the women members had gotten together and caucused ahead of time, shrewdly, and they said, "Hey, we got to have a woman president of this new APA." And everybody else was unorganized, and they voted as a block, and they got a woman. That was fine. I felt that I'd done enough to get the two together. I was more anxious to become president of APA than I was to serve. So I became president, I think it was in 77, 78, and then I was a founding board member. That's all I was.
Okay. So that's an excellent history of the sort of the main elements of it. I mean, so the Leon mentioned, Leon Niplin, I guess, was involved in there.
Well, he was the president of AIP somewhere in there. I think it was after I left as executive director.
Right.
So we brought all his glory and fame and pride to the Atlanta region, which no one knows about. Who cares?
Well, do you want to talk a little bit more about when you were executive director of AIP? I mean, you sort of mentioned the conferences and some of the time period you were there. Any other major sorts of activities you can recall?
AIP was, at the time I came in, it had all kinds of baggage and all kinds of new commitments. And they said, "Here, Tom," as I said, they without casting aspersions on earlier staffs or anything, they had a hell of a big debt, to the point where they canceled their fall conference supposed to be in, I forget, Florida, I guess. And well, if you know anything about national association organizations, if you cancel a conference, you get on a bad list, you're not a real. And so first thing we had to do was put together a conference to start up again, and we redesigned it to make it more appealing to the students and young people, it was called a confer-in, like a sit-in.
Yeah.
And people were urged to send in their own ideas for programs. It wasn't going to be us writing the program and the agenda. They did it. And all kinds of stuff, and arguments and debates and all kinds of good stuff. And it worked very well. The students, by that time, Vietnam was settling down, and they kind of came back in. So the first confer-in was in Minneapolis, St. Paul in 1970, I believe. And that started the that gave AIP some viability so it could be merged into something. And we paid off the debt. We started individual, they were called departments, but that's misleading. In addition to belonging to an AIP and an AIP chapter, such as Georgia, I should say that before then the chapters were regional. There was Southeast AIP, of which Georgia was a section. And we wiped all that out and made everybody a chapter. So we had a whole new series of chapters to relate to, all chapter presidents. In addition to that, before this, we'd had a membership program which just old established AIP members would sign up that this young whippersnapper is a good guy, and he's had X years of good planning, so he's in. Well, we replaced that, not with the standardized test that came along later, which is very easy to administer, but in the planner's old tradition, we created a complicated thing called it was an oral examination. And it went on for years where they would have to convene local qualified planners to be a 3-person board, and you would apply for examination. And the idea was that it was integrative. In addition to being a comprehensive planner, the idea is to integrate things. You would have a specialty, and there were 12 areas of concentration. And you could be a transportation planner, or a land use planner, a housing planner, environmental planner, 12 of those. And then your examination would be based on a series of discussion questions, after which you'd be voted in or out. Well, that becomes very arguable. The guy say, well, the guy that interviewed me, he wasn't fair. All that kind of, unlike a standardized New Jersey test where you check things. So, and the people who showed up for the panels were notoriously undependable. We'd have 6 applicants signed up in San Diego, and one of the board reviewers wouldn't show up. It was a mess. So that got changed eventually. So we had to create new departments. We had to create new chapters. We had to establish a new membership test, and I'm probably leaving some other things out. We had to get rid of the debt. We had to reestablish credibility with diverse kinds of folks, young people who wanted to change the world and old people who didn't. I'm being simplistic here, but it was not the happiest 3 years of my life, but I hope it was useful. As I look back, I was thinking about our meeting today. I was trying to think, what the hell have I done that matters? I think you do that as you get older. Does it matter? Or how many papers did I sign? Or how many perfunctory zoning ordinance did I write? And I'm saying this trying to be humble, not boastful, because a hell of a lot of stuff I did didn't matter, I'm sure. But if I had to pick some things that I'm pleased, that I feel that I'm glad I did it. Ironically, most of them are institutional. They're not physical plans. They're not economic plans. One of them was the expansion of the 2-county MPC to the 5-county AR MPC, which I'm sure by the time Dan Sweat came in, it was probably out of date, but it wasn't when it was started. It got the regional planning effort from 1956 to 1971, I guess, something like that. So that was important. I know for a fact that there'd be no rapid transit system in Atlanta if the people who were were working on it hadn't done it. And I think rapid transit is just crucial. Maybe we need different forms, light rail, maybe we need different directions. We sure as heck need more counties. But I think that's so important. We didn't really get people to redo land use to fit with transit. That's hard because it involves zoning and profit and so on. The third thing, I guess, was saving AIP because it was going down the toilet. And there wouldn't have been anything to merge with ASPO. There wouldn't be anything to carry the professional flag because professionalism is an important part of planning. It's important that we know the history of who were the early planners, what did they do right and wrong, and how do we get where we are today. And the fourth thing would be the getting ASPO and AIP, which were two proud organizations, but were having difficulties getting them together so that they would have one interface with the federal government, one interrelationship with other agencies, and so on. So,
do you remember some of the other people that were influential at that time in merging?
Is Stolman, of course, who was the executive director of AIP, and my counterpart, or what I was formerly. I can list some of the people who were obstacles, but I don't think that's useful. I really can't. I think it was it was an idea that was lying around that the members were willing to go for, but as so often is the case, the bureaucracies couldn't see giving up their autonomy. I think that it was we just brought a bunch of people together and they argued and haggled, and somehow they got the feeling that, well, we just got to get this done. It was like Sadat and Begin or something. I don't know what it was like.
You've had a unique perspective going back to the 50s. I mean,
I'm old.
About Atlanta. Now we've seen some retrenchment back into the city. You mentioned getting the land use change around MARTA. Well, that's even happening today. We have MARTA station areas that are still the same they were probably 40 years ago, and some that are real transit villages. What do you think we've, in addition to MARTA, what do you think we've done right? What do you think are still challenges?
In regional planning today?
Regional and local.
Well, I think that there was never a regional park and open space component of the plan until the 1961 plan. And some of those have actually come into being. Mm-hmm. The
Sweetwater
old
Creek.
Sweetwater Creek, the old uniform factory, and surely the Metropolitan River Protection Act has been a great thing, which I can't take credit for. I mean, I administered the reviews, but I think it was pretty much Dan. When Dan was here for a year or two after I came, I mean, he sued one of his own counties because they weren't sending referrals in. He sued Fulton County because they said, we don't have to send that stuff in. And he was very, I think Dan he talked slowly and he looked like he was going to sleep half the time, but he was always thinking about how can we put something together better. It was a great loss when he went to, well, it was a great advantage to Central Atlanta Progress, a great loss when he died. I think the referral thing I mentioned earlier about requiring people to bring their projects if they're important enough, if they're intergovernmental in their impact, or if they're big enough to make a matter, whether it's along the river, whether it's I assume it's still true that you can save transit right away. I think that's fine. Now that's only advisory, I know. I think land use is the big problem. It's the whole land use decision-making process is totally decentralized, totally politicized. When I was a consultant, I was always being asked to be an expert witness for one side or the other, and I had to stop and think about it. Yeah, I could do that, but I'm not sure that's a good idea. Now, it's not easy for a consultant to do that, but I did. And I tried to be a consultant to public entities as often as private. That was impossible because public agencies have their own staffs and developers don't, so they're more likely to hire you. But I would really like to see a system, I don't know whether the Florida system's still around, that would require the capacity and the density and the location and the category of land use to be related to the infrastructure that's going to take to serve it, especially roads and transit. You take 100 acres and you put in so many families per acre, that's simple arithmetic to know how many trips that's going to generate and where. It's not that hard. With a model, you can say, well, you're either going to have to cut the density or you're going to increase hefty sewer and highway capacity. We don't have that linkage. I've written articles about it, and I've kvetched, and it's an old Yiddish word, I guess. And I don't really see it happening because it smacks of socialism too much. Other countries do it, but we don't. And as long as land use is going this way and public infrastructure decisions are going that way, you're going to have this crunch all the time. As to what your question, what else have they done right? Well, I think a lot of things were done right. You know, there have been things that have knitted together water plans and environmental issues and so on. But, and maybe this is fine, regional planning today is still pretty much beholden to the local governments that comprise it. Now, that's not true in other places. It's true today. Maybe that's okay, but it does put a certain practical political cap on what an ARC is going to do. Because who is ARC? It's the local governments. Who are they? They're the people who make decisions, and they should. And talk as we will about regionalism, I think a mayor has to think about his city first. So that I think that's an institutional problem. That the answer would be neat and clean and good government, but maybe it's not practical. Maybe it's not all that good. You do need local control as well, and how you mesh local decisions that have to be done locally with regional decisions is not easy, and it would mean changing the power structure a lot. So,
what do you think of $4 gas, approaching $4 of gas in our development patterns? I'm kind of being funny here, but I think you can remember.
You want me to be Hillary or Barack? Well,
you can remember when gas was 50 cents or
25. Oh, now listen. When I was a kid, I hate to do this. When Rockefeller was still around, they had gas wars where he was trying to squeeze everybody else out, and he would just cut the price. It'd be 11 cents, and you'd get your windshield washed and get free dishes for 11 cents a gallon. It was about 18 cents a gallon when I got married, about a quarter a gallon when I lived in Doraville in '56. But those were small. That was inflation a lot. If you just ask me hypothetically, and if I had the power to do it, I don't know if I would. The price of gas ought to be a lot higher because of what it's doing to the environment and so on. There ought to be a price to pay, just like they're talking about transferring among industries, that if you're going to do this to the air, you got to pay for it.
Cap and trade.
Cars are burning oil in a way that hurts, and gas in a way that hurts the environment. In addition to which, when we burn that much gas, we are buying it at great prices from oil-producing countries who host terrorists. So there's all that stuff. Jimmy Carter talked about environment. I remember back when I was at ARC and Jimmy Carter was running for president, and one of the big reporters, I can't think of his name, from the Washington Post, they go around and talk, and he came to interview me. Why me? I don't know. He said, tell me about this guy, Jimmy Carter. And I said, well, the two things he really believes in are race relations and the environment, and that was true. He talked about it, and he wasn't a very successful president. Gore's talking about it. I don't know. I think that $4 a gallon is terribly hard on people, but it's not enough to pay for the damage that it's doing the environment. How's that for a queasy answer?
That's an excellent answer. I think you'd, when you were thinking about how much impact you've had, I think it would make you feel good to know how much. It is amazing how many planners, young people, are coming into the planning profession. I wonder if I haven't tracked it or anything, but Georgia Tech, their freshman class is over 50 kids just in their graduate planning class.
It's amazing. I get a newsletter from the North Carolina Planning School. And incidentally, the people I haven't mentioned to whom I owe a huge debt, are Jack Parker and Stu Chapin and Jim Webb, who started that little planning school in North Carolina. It just changed my whole life. They were wonderful people. They had a little school. There were 8 of us in our class, and when I opened up the most recent there's a double page. It looked like 200 plans. I don't know how many there were. And I would say that 92% of them were women. And I remember when I used to lecture at the University of Florida Law School, over half of them would be women, which is a huge change from when I remember when I was in engineering school, there was one woman in the whole school which created a real problem when we went out to surveying camp, because these are all guys and you got one woman, and what are you going to do? You're right. I don't know where all the jobs are coming from. Where are all these students getting hired? Because the day of the federal grant has shrunk a lot.
It has, but our population has swelled, and a lot of consultants and other things.
I think the main thing they can do is to instill you with a sense of responsibility, public decision-making responsibility. The tricks of the trade, like how long should a cul-de-sac be, they're not going to teach you all that stuff, or how many cars per hour can 1,200 vehicles. I think they have to instill you with a sense of what you're here for and what you're trying to do. If you get into economic planning or social planning or physical transportation planning, that's something else again. They can't prepare you. They can prepare you for the integrative idea, and to know that you'll never know as much as the traffic engineer does about traffic engineering, or the landscape designer, architect does about site planning. But what you're supposed to know is how to bring these things together, whether it's in writing or talking. I always thought journalism would be a good undergraduate. When I came into planning, it was the 6 undergraduate preferences were civil engineering, architecture, landscape architecture, landscape design, sociology, economics, and public administration. That was not bad for today. But I've known guys that came from journalism that they have to be quick studies, they have to communicate, they have to deal with a lot of issues, they have to understand the public, and I thought that would be a good start for a planner. I know that while I was gone to Washington for 6 years, and we had left this rapid transit planning process bubbling along, I remember Leon came along and he looked at them and he noticed that some of these proposed lines didn't go through the middle of communities like West End or Decatur. And frankly, we were looking at the bottom line of costs, so we were keeping them along the railroad lines. But he argued that they should be swerved out into the middle of Decatur and into the middle of West End to serve as nodes. And I think he was right. I just, things change as you go along. In the 1961 plan, we were still showing freeways through neighborhoods which were viewed as disgusting 5 years later. You don't do that.
Well, I have a question for you. Was there really not a station at the Omni when you first looked at it?
There was not. Who told you that? I can't. Just come back, and I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I said, you can't do that. You can't have a line at 5 points and then go out to the west side like that, and not the Omni had just come into. And Alan Keeper was the executive director or the general manager of MARTA, and I'd known Alan. He used to be Fulton County manager before he went to Richmond and came back. I think we probably didn't handle it too well. We didn't start with him because I was afraid we might get squelched down, and we just kind of bounced up at one of the meetings one day and said, hey, you ought to have a station there, and here's why. And engineers say, well, it's not engineeringly feasible. Well, anything's engineeringly feasible. It's a matter of trade-off and what are you going to get. And so they did. They built which I think would have been terrible oversight. They built a station at the Omni.